Hello everyone, I'm Doreen Finkel, CEO of CampusTeaParties.com. I'd like to thank you for watching our program today, and for more information, please log on to CampusTeaParties.com. That's CampusTeaParties.com. Thank you.
He hosts debates in and around the state of New York. He was a former producer from Fox News. Everyone give up a hand for Todd Seeley. And I'm going to turn this thing over to him and put control.
All right, thanks everyone. Now, tonight we're going to try to cover 9 or 10 topics, fairly broad, basic ones, and here's conservative, libertarian, and liberal view on each of these things. So, even though it's the case that there are all sorts of internal divisions within each of these political movements on some of these questions, we're sort of sticking to the basics tonight. And we'll start with a 3-minute opening statement from each of the participants. And after that, with each subsequent question, I'll ask you to probably stick to about 2 minutes. And I won't be too rigid about it, but if somebody starts rambling, I may just gently nudge you to wrap up. I guess we'll start with the speaker closest to me, if nobody minds that arbitrary method. And I will introduce the 3 of them now. Tonight we'll hear from conservative Dr. David Tubbs. Professor David Tubbs of King's College earned his PhD in politics at Princeton University, concentrating in political philosophy, constitutional law, and Russian studies. In his scholarship, Professor Tubbs writes about contemporary politics, constitutional law, and current debates in public policy. His book, Freedom's Orphans, was published by Princeton University Press in 2007 and widely received favorable reviews. Professor Tubbs has a special interest in the politics of post-communist Europe, including the former Soviet Union. He'll be followed by libertarian Dr. Yuri Maltz. Dr. Yuri Maltz is a professor of economics at Carthage College and a fellow at the Mises Institute. Before defecting to the U.S. in 1989, he was a member of a senior economics team that worked on President Gorbachev's reform package of perestroika. Before settling in the Midwest, he was a senior fellow at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C., a federal research agency. He has authored 5 books and over 100 articles. And our liberal or leftist over there, Dr. Grover Furr, is an English professor at Montclair State University, which some of you have heard of. He completed his undergraduate work at McGill University and his MA and PhD at Princeton. Furr is a medieval scholar, but is also active in the Radical Caucus of the Modern Language Association, and is the author of the book Khrushchev Lied, and several political essays, including Uncritical Reading and the Discourse of Anti-Communism, Protest, Rebellion, Commitment, Then and Now, and Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform. A hand for our 3 speakers. And now, with a basic overview of what each of their factions believes, we'll start off with conservative Dr. David Tubbs.
Thank you, Todd. So, I guess I have to address the question what it means to be conservative in the United States now. As I just indicated, there's certainly some disagreement among conservatives as to what the essential attributes are, or the most important considerations are. So, what you're going to get from me is my own interpretation of conservatism in the context of the United States. And I realize that in some matters I probably sound like a mainstream American conservative, but in other matters I think I don't fall within the mainstream of U.S. conservatism. So, with that preface out of the way, let me say the following. I am a conservative in the sense that I believe that American liberal democracy deserves to be affirmed. It deserves to be affirmed by pretty much everybody who lives here. Why should it be affirmed? Because the institutions that the United States has are remarkably stable and are responsible for millions of people leading decent, prosperous lives. I believe that to affirm liberal democracy means affirming the messiness of politics and let me just explain briefly what I mean by that. To be a conservative, in my judgment, to be an intelligent conservative means being ever resistant to utopian schemes of politics. And I think the most sensible appreciation of conservatism recognizes that it is not ever, if it remains true to its roots, ever going to go in the direction of the utopian kind of politics. Take my affirmation of liberal democracy. What do I mean by that? And in what sense is the very affirmation of liberal democracy and acknowledgement of how messy politics can get? Well, we believe that for a decent life, a decent political life, people have to have both personal freedom and representation through democratic channels. We believe that to have one without the other is simply intolerable. And what does that mean? Well, it sometimes means that personal freedom and the claims of the group, the claims of the collective, are in tension with one another. So I say I want to affirm liberal democracy because however precarious the balance might be between the demands of the collectivity and the needs of individuals, the needs of personal freedom, the mix, the combination, the synthesis works pretty well in the United States. So I characterize conservatism as anti-utopian. I characterize it as not reducible to a few simple formulas and principles. And I also want to emphasize the following. And I think most conservatives will do this, but maybe not. I want to emphasize that to affirm freedom also means affirming responsibility. It means affirming responsibility in many different ways. And that's one of the themes I'd like to develop at different points tonight during this debate.
All right, thanks very much. And now on to Dr. Maltz.
Well, first thing I want to say, I'm not a conservative because I don't want to conserve anything. And that's, I think, a quote from Hayek, great economist of the 20th century. And definitely, I think out of three schools of political thought, the only one which is strongly for individual liberty, for property rights, for economic prosperity, is classical liberalism or libertarianism. So there's plenty of different schools within the libertarian movement in the United States. And many libertarians, according to different polls, it's about a quarter of our population are libertarians. So a lot of people may be voting for Republicans or Democrats and consider themselves libertarian, consider themselves for individual liberty. And this kind of society produced, I would say, the greatest achievements in the history of human race. The third alternative would be socialism, which socialism, I would say, it's not even an economic society. Great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises called it a revolt against economics, a revolt against a system of public slavery, which resulted in mass murder, in murdering in the country I came from anywhere from 40 to 60 million people, 40 to 60 million people. So you can see that these are alternatives, and the alternative to that, to public slavery and mass murder, is individual liberty, property rights, and the markets. So free minds, free markets, that's what makes countries great, prosperous, and nice places to live. And the problem is not only with say, socialism as it was in the so-called socialist countries, but almost any government, or not almost all governments, are socialist in its nature. The only difference would be the size of the government. Either you have a big government, so you have a lot of socialism, and then you have countries like Soviet Union with 11 time zones. Can you imagine 11 time zones? It's 3 times bigger than the United States and Canada combined. So if it was something too big to fail, it was definitely the Soviet Union. And it failed miserably, completely destroyed by its own government, completely destroyed by its own government. Why mass murder is so widely practiced in socialist countries with a lot of government, and even in the United States with all these overseas wars and adventures that our government is involved because there are not so many incentives. And in the case of, say, public slavery, to keep slaves in check. You need to murder them, and the murders were administered randomly. And I think that today would be, I would refer quite a lot to my Soviet experiences, because not because I think that people would borrow much from that. I worked for the federal government, as you mentioned. Well, worked for federal government, so already it sounds like an oxymoron. And I worked at the government think tank, United States Institute of Peace, which, like most government think tanks, didn't think much, I would say. But, and I could see the government, how it is. So we need to keep it in check, to keep it small, and then we will have liberty, not the people in government.
All right, thanks very much. And Dr. Furr.
Thank you. I have a 3-minute statement which I will read. The fundamental fact of this and every capitalist society is exploitation. Everyone knows at least a little about exploitation. Your employer pays you as little as he can for your labor while getting as much out of you as possible. You produce more value than you are paid. The difference between the value your labor produces and the value you are paid, minus cost, is the employer's profit. This basic relationship, employer-employee, or exploiter to exploited, is the root cause of all the misery in this world. There is no need in nature for a single child to go hungry, ill-clothed, ill-housed, ill-educated, without medical care, or for any student to have to pay for higher education, or for any adult to lack a fulfilling job. There is no need for poverty, racism, sexism, or crimes of property. There is no need for wars of imperialist conquest. The necessity is in the capitalist system, in the system of exploitation by which employers try constantly to lower the cost of labor while increasing the amount of value they can extract from their employees. Labor costs include benefits, the social wage. Most benefits are mediated by the government, like public schools, unemployment insurance, Social Security, Medicare, facilities for recreation for the disabled and elderly, and many others. The proper name for services mediated by the government is socialism. As poll after poll reveals, most Americans are socialist in this sense, though they have been scared away from the term socialism. Capitalists want socialism for the rich, all kinds of government tax breaks, incentives, and benefits for themselves, and the free market for working people. No thanks. We need socialism for working people. We need big government that restricts the ability of employers to exploit. But both political parties are parties of capitalists. So no matter which capitalist party wins the upcoming election, we will lose. A word about liberty. In the American Civil War, the slave owners' freedom to own and exploit slaves was taken away from them by force and without compensation. That was a triumph for freedom for working people. Likewise, in the Russian Revolution of 1917, the capitalist exploiters' property was taken away from them by force and without compensation. That was another great victory for freedom for working people. We need to struggle for as much socialism as we can get. But the problem with socialism is that the capitalists have state power. As long as capitalism endures, even a minimum standard of living will be under attack. We need a system run by and for the vast majority of the population. For a time, the communist movement of the 20th century did this. We need to study what the communist movement of the 20th century did that was successful, and what it did that was mistaken, and caused this tragic reversion back to capitalism. We need to do it better the next time. Thank you.
All right. And interestingly, though we did not exactly plan this, all three of our speakers have a certain special interest in Russia. So even though we're mainly talking about American politics, I can't resist asking if each of you, just for about 2 minutes per answer from here on out, could explain what you think we can learn from the experience of Russia in the 20th century, if anything, and whether the conventional narrative, which is sort of Marxism leads to mass murder, is wrong or right. And why don't we start out with Dr. Furr on this one, and then come back this way.
All right, first of all, let me tell you, I've spent the last 10 years pretty much exclusively, and many years before that, studying the history of the Soviet Union. And with all due respect to my colleague here, the story of the mass murders of 40 to 60 million people is bunk, it's lies, it's bullshit. That doesn't mean that I'm not accusing you, Professor Maltz, of lying. You may very well believe it. Many people do believe it. They've been taught it. But it isn't true. I've researched it, and I'm interested. I'd be interested to know if it really happened, but it didn't happen. What are the lessons of the collapse of the Soviet Union? Well, let me just say one thing about the success. We have Social Security, Medicare, unemployment insurance, and we have all those things because they were put into effect in the 1930s by the Roosevelt administration. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was appointed to be the Democratic, or sure to be the Democratic candidate for president in 1932, because Cyrus Eaton, a billionaire of the time, said, this is the man who's going to save capitalism for us. All right? And he saved capitalism by creating all of these reforms that I just mentioned. So every time you think about the benefits of the few socialist benefits that we have now, I'm collecting Social Security, for example, okay, we can thank the Soviet Union of the 1930s, which means thanking Joseph Stalin for those benefits. That's why we've got them. And now they don't have a communist or a socialist society like the Soviet Union, they're being taken away. What did the Soviet Union do that was wrong? It kept inequalities, material incentives. It retained too much of what came before it, capitalism. Lenin said we didn't have the luxury of smashing the state like we wanted to. We had to take it over. In my view, we have to, of course, that's a simplified version. We have to study this experience hard to find out where they went wrong. But I think that's the direction we need to go in. But we all have benefited tremendously from the socialist movement of the 20th century. And that's not even saying the fact that without it, we'd all be speaking German and goose-stepping down the middle of the street with the Nazis.
And just for clarity, I think I would probably refer to Dr. Furr's position as the leftist position, as opposed to the liberal position, just to be clear on that.
That's why it's Marxist.
But, anyway, but I'm guessing that some of what he said, Dr. Maltz will disagree with.
Yes.
There is a pretty sad Russian saying that the only lesson of history is that it does not teach us anything. And Dr. Furr, he mentioned slavery. As disgusting as public slavery was, as private slavery was, say, it never resulted in such a huge mass murder as public slavery. Also, I think China was mentioned, or poverty. I remember I was in Hong Kong in the beginning of 1990s, and I saw this remnants of nets put near the beaches of Hong Kong to prevent the corpses of little babies thrown into the Yellow River to reach these fancy beaches. And why would they be murdered by their own parents? Because people were desperately poor. And today you can see China is emerging with the help of market economy, with the help of capitalism. You can see poverty is being eradicated. This exploitation was, I would say, in the so-called socialist countries, it reached absurd proportions. Because the only incentives under socialism was fear. People were scared to death. And that's what the government was doing. I lived most of my life there. And now I'm taking my students to Cuba, which is kind of the world preserve of real socialism, to see how that beautiful island is completely destroyed by the same people. How the people are earning $9 per month. Can you imagine? Average wages, $9 per month. You can see mothers are selling their daughters to sex slavery. It's very, very sad. Then we talked a little bit about this free things, like free social security or free health care, free education. Well, if you remember private slavery, everything was free as well. That was the case all the time. But the quality of this was appalling. Because we are being royally brainwashed in the United States in favor of socialism and the freebies the government would dispense on us. So one of my students, she asked a friend of mine, whom I know from my Moscow days, he is Cuban, she said, Mr. Rodriguez, but we heard that you have the best health care in the world. Because you know that the biggest propaganda person, biggest in the real sense, Mr. Moore, he made this sickening movie, Sicko, about this so-called presumed achievements of Cuban healthcare. And she said, well, we have a wonderful healthcare system. And he said, yes, we have the best healthcare All right, this is like in Soviet Union. And he said, yes, we have the best healthcare in the world, but it could be better if we would have doctors and hospitals and medicines and ambulances. It could be improved. And then when we were exiting the room, he, in Russian already, he said, Yui, the only healthcare we have is to swim to Miami right away.
All right, and Dr. Tubbs.
So I make some comments based on the two perspectives that we just heard, and I'll be relatively brief. So it would go something like this. I guess having spent a lot of time studying Russia and the history of the Soviet Union, having traveled there extensively, I have a certain fondness for the people in Russia and other places of former Soviet Union, Ukraine, for example. And so when I look at the history of Russia and its experiment with communism in the 20th century, I see the extremes. I see conduct and behavior that I find extremely admirable, and also different kinds of behavior that I find deplorable. Extremes. For example, everybody associated with the attempt to disseminate the truth about the evils committed under the Stalin leadership during the Stalin era. Persons such as Solzhenitsyn, writers, cultural figures close to Solzhenitsyn, the famous Russian literary family, the Tchaikovsky family, the great cellist Rostakrovich. I see deeply admirable conduct from such people. I also would say something favorable about a few leaders in Russia in the 20th century. For example, I still have respect for Mikhail Gorbachev for two reasons. One, because he encouraged historians to look honestly at the history of the Soviet Union. And two, in a way that was a great surprise to many persons, he was able to essentially bring the Soviet Union to an end without armed conflict with the West. I don't think anybody could have predicted that, say, in the 1960s or the 1970s. I make one final point about the matter of the history of the Soviet Union. When I was in graduate school, I recall reading an article in the New York Times about a Frenchman who was very skeptical, very, very skeptical about the claims, the historical claims about the number of Jews who died during the Second World War in the Nazi death camps. He thought that the figure was grossly, grossly exaggerated. And this man was a professional engineer, and then he realized after some reflection that he probably could go to the death camps and make an assessment as to whether the figures were possible. And the standard figure, for example, at the death camp in Poland known as Birkenau, the standard figure given was 20,000 deaths per day. And this engineer said, if I go there and if I look at the institution from top to bottom, I probably can determine whether this was feasible. And much to his great surprise, he made the journey, he did calculations, he had discussions with other professional engineers, and he said, on this basis, I now believe that it's undoubtedly true. So I want to affirm that these matters of historical disagreement are not infinitely subjective. This French engineer was quite skeptical. He thought that the figures were grossly exaggerated. He admitted later that he thought that there was some kind of influence of the Jewish media. He went there himself and he said, I accept the standard figures, 5 to 6 million Jews killed as a result of Nazi policies in the Second World War.
All right, well, and speaking of warfare, let's pivot there and move on to foreign policy and stick with Dr. Tubbs for now. What would you say is the basic conservative view of foreign policy, and is the conservative view on foreign policy still, say, the same as it was during the Cold War we were just talking about?
Well, I think the United States, because of its special status in the world, has special opportunities, but I would emphasize more strongly special responsibilities. And by this I mean the United States, notwithstanding all of its imperfections as a society, its imperfections today, the gap in its history, the many gaps in its histories between professed ideals and reality, the United States is still regarded by many people in the world, to borrow the words from Abraham Lincoln, as the last And by that I mean, I still believe that the United States is a positive force for change in the world. It can still be this. But the United States must realize, and I think intelligent conservatives would all concede this, that it can't do everything that it wishes to do. It can't do everything that it regards as the morally right thing to do. And we have seen this, especially in the last 10 years, reflecting on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have seen that our means are limited, and that there are some wars that we might think can be handled quickly and without great loss of life, when in fact they go on for much longer than we expected, and they end up being almost intractable problems. Nonetheless, I believe that the United States does have to provide leadership in the world because of its special status. And I would simply say that being mindful that our resources are limited, we've got to choose carefully. We've got to choose carefully, and everything that we do in the realm of foreign policy should not be guided exclusively by consideration of our national interests. Occasionally we should be asking ourselves, can we help out? For example, could we have helped out in Rwanda in the 1990s, mid-1990s, to have averted the genocide there? I think a very modest contribution from the United States in terms of troops or manpower to the United Nations might have averted the genocide in Rwanda. So it's not exclusively from a conservative perspective about American interests. It's also about the possibility that America has special responsibility because of its status, its special status in the world.
And Dr.
Yes, I have a question for the liberal spokesman. You said that the idea of communist mass killings was baloney.
It's baloney.
Something to that word. Yet in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, apologized to the Communist Party for the killings that were done by Stalin under his personality cult. So he conceded that there were a lot of murders. And I have a question for you. Was Khrushchev lying, or if you concede that there were state murders under Stalin, do you see that that's a continuing tool under communist regimes? But the consensus number seems to be between 100 and 150 million people killed by communist regimes. And I'm wondering, communism wasn't successful. Do you think maybe there's an optimum number that if enough people were killed, that it would be successful? Maybe 1 billion, 2 billion?
Dr. Furr?
Well, that's not a serious question.
Well, it is actually it is. Mass murders,
Okay, I'm going to answer you. I'm gonna answer you.
it's a tool of the communist regimes.
I'm gonna answer you.
So they thought it worked. Did they not do it enough?
I'm going to answer you.
Okay.
Okay? You finished asking? I'm going to answer you. What you said is bullshit. It's wrong. It's a lie. The history of the Soviet Union is the most falsified. American history is falsified. All right? I lived in Canada for a number of years. The Canadian school system falsifies Canadian history. But of all the falsifications that go on in the school systems in this country, this world, Soviet history is falsified the most. I have spent many years researching this and similar questions, and I have yet to find one crime, that Stalin committed. I know, they all say he killed 20 and 30 and 40 million people. It's bullshit.
Was it Goebbels that said it's the big lie that's successful?
Goebbels said the big lie is successful, and this is the big lie.
There you have it.
This is the big lie. That the communists, that Stalin killed millions of people, and that socialism is no good. Just a word about socialist medicine. The United States has the lowest standard of living of any of the industrialized countries, and they all have some form of socialist health care. And you should have it too.
I think our actual ex-Soviet would like to weigh in on it.
Well, I mentioned that 40 to 60 million people were in the Soviet Union, and I don't even care 40 or 60, because both numbers are completely horrendous and unthinkable. And I would like to quote Stalin, a great humanist. Stalin used to say, death of one person is a tragedy. Death of a million, just statistic.